Hello and welcome back to our Justice Administration course. This module we're talking about administration within the correctional system. And let's just start with a little information about our correctional system within the United States. In 2025, there are 1.8 million individuals incarcerated. 3.67 million are on probation and parole. And of those, the United States spends $80 billion annually on corrections. So let's look at the duties of the correctional administrators. The wardens oversee security, rehabilitation, and staff management. Next are the middle managers, which are a lot of times the shift supervisors. They handle the operations of the correctional facility, as well as supervisory role over the correctional officers. And then we have the officers, and these are those that have direct day-to-day contact with the inmates, and their responsibilities include safety, inmate accountability, and rehabilitation support. And the training for wardens includes not only training of the facility, but also leadership. And this training includes ethics, crisis response. The good leadership emphasizes fairness, transparency, and accountability, as well as the wardens are historically involved in executions. Now, states have really moved away from capital punishment, so we don't see this as much as we did in the history. A unique feature of the correctional subsystem of the criminal justice system is that almost every personnel member of the correctional system has a supervisory role, and that's in regard to inmates, probationers, or parolees. Probation and parole officers are often required to have 4-year college degrees. However, institutional corrections officers generally have minimal education requirements. And this is ironic given their supervisory capacity over inmates, as well as the impact that their interactions with the inmates have upon the attitudes of the inmates. Now, correctional officers, and I apologize for the skips, I'm on a different type of computer, but correctional officers, they carry out all the administrator's plans. They interpret and apply institutional policy, they plan, they do organizing, as well as supervising the inmate activities and their work functions. They ensure maintenance of the physical plant and equipment while avoiding circumstances that could lead to litigation, and engage in most of the decision making. So think of this, with correctional officers really having all these responsibilities, what kind of educational requirements should we be placed on them? Another argument for emphasizing higher education levels for correctional officers is with regard to job satisfaction. There are numerous studies that have indicated officers obtaining higher education levels often express greater job satisfaction. It's not clear as to what kind of task the subject officers had been assigned within the study. However, Peake notes that correctional officers that merely patrol cell blocks are subject to higher degrees of job dissatisfaction than those that engage in the activities that are more stimulating, such as providing human services to the inmates. Furthermore, another study by the National Institute of Corrections concluded that officers feel strongly about staff empowerment, participative management, and they have a feeling that their jobs are worthwhile. So if correctional officers were to take more of a management role in the operation of correctional facilities and provide human services to the inmates, then it would seem that a higher educational requirement for correctional officers would actually be more desirable. In addition to its higher education implications, the field supervision aspect has major implications for training. So think of if you are an administrator in a correctional facility, you may want to seriously consider providing basic supervisory training to your rank and file employees. The line level correctional officers could certainly benefit from instruction concerning supervisory motivation, disciplinary actions, conflict resolution, and managing resources. After all, correction officers, they deal with such issues all the time in their day-to-day supervision of inmates. Understanding the comprehensive role of correctional subordinates, it's an important component of prison administration. In fact, this point dovetails nicely with the Texas General Discussion of Prison Leadership Principles that are offered by John DiLulio. In the text, there are 6 such principles that are advanced as being characteristic of good prison leaders. Chief among these principles is the shifting of focus to looking at the results rather than the process. As true community policing does with the police department, this requires really a paradigm shift in how we view organizational structure and function. Bureaucracy, by design, necessarily focuses on process, with the expectation that acceptable and predictable results will then follow. DiLulio suggests this thinking is backwards. He said start with performance goals, appropriate procedures will then emerge and follow. Peake notes that both institutional and community corrections in recent years have really focused upon incapacitation and retribution, just desserts. Now, much of this focus has been due to political pressures, and earlier studies have concluded that rehabilitative efforts were really futile, while the directions pursued by corrections appears to be in line with legislative wishes and can be supported with these aforementioned studies. It must be kept in mind that corrections is part of the bigger picture. It's part of the criminal justice system. It's a subsystem. And consequently, as noted in the first segments of the class, it's imperative that the goals of the corrections subsystem is compatible with the goals of the criminal justice system. Thus again begs the question as to what are the agreed upon goals of the criminal justice system. If prevention of crime through the rehabilitation of past offenders is really the goal, then shouldn't corrections be focused on that goal and not neglect that goal? Rehabilitation was once recognized as a valid goal of corrections. However, with the dissemination of the results of some studies that really suggest rehabilitation efforts of correctional agencies has been unsuccessful, and we see that with recidivism. It appears that corrections has really abandoned rehabilitation as a goal. In essence, corrections was found to have failed in obtaining their goal of rehabilitation. Rather than experimenting with alternative rehabilitation efforts and trying different avenues, corrections has really eliminated rehabilitation as a goal and emphasized goals which can be effectively carried out. Example, retribution and incapacitation. So if rehabilitation is not a goal or is viewed as an unobtainable goal, what implications does that suggest in regards to sentencing of convicted offenders, if they are to be prevented from recidivism over the long term, from continuing to be a menace to society, but we've neglected that rehabilitation that can help with that long-term lower recidivism rate. One issue of concern for jail and prison administrators alike is really that of overcrowding, and we hear of this quite frequently. The text in this part raises some really good questions concerning the issue of overcrowding. In particular, the hypothesis that density alone defines overcrowding is challenged. As Kenneth Peace pointed out, overcrowding is better defined by the dynamic properties of social interaction rather than density per se. He notes that inmates in jails and prisons tend to feel overcrowded when there's a combination of factors. And these factors include high density of inmates. An example, many people in limited spaces, but the factors also include low resources, little to do, and the perception that the inmates have little control over their lives, to the extent that these various factors are present all at once, and the perception of overcrowding by inmates is heightened. The administrator really is attempting to deal with disgruntled inmates, which is a perception for all practical purposes. Many practitioners and scholars alike believe that the solution is to change the quality of life behind bars. The simple display of concern for inmates' quality of life is controversial and continues to be. These people are not our customers, they are our charge. And many professionals and scholars say they are to be managed and not coddled. Few things really get taxpayers and society more irate than the news expose on the perks of prison life. They have free cable TV, readily available porn, exercise equipment that can make most YMCAs and community centers pale, free college education, and many other perks. But law enforcement officers in particular are really the most vocal critics of these kinds of things, especially the weight sets. In a cop's mind, all this does is provide inmates with a means to really buff up before their next encounter with the police. And this is in contradiction that the current trend really is to now severely limit access to free weights within the prison facility. The public and law enforcement often really fail to appreciate that these so-called perks, they're really not perks at all, but they're privileges, and they earn these privileges. So privileges, by definition, are not entitlements because they can be revoked, and they are often in response to bad behavior when they're revoked. So really the inmates are stuck. They are already incarcerated, and correctional employees really have little leverage over the population but to provide and then remove a necessary privilege, and it's those things that the inmates deem desirable. So that's one of the most significant ways to handle inmates that are incarcerated, especially for long periods of time, because this does give leverage to the correctional officers in regards to their behavior. And I want to end this presentation. Let's just talk quickly about supermax prisons. These are highly restrictive confinement. It's a 23-hour lockdown. These cause psychological harms, and they also invoke human rights concerns. In 2023-24, several states restricted long-term solitary confinement, and there continues to be a debate over the constitutionality and necessity of this solitary confinement in supermax prisons. Solitary confinement, as we know, increases mental health issues, increases any mental health concerns that an inmate might have. And so this is one, as I mentioned, this is a debate going on now, and looking for ways to improve.